weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein in die Arbeit einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein in die Arbeiter einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Drum links, 2, 3, drum links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich ein in die Arbeiter einheimst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Здравствуйте, comrades. Welcome to an early edition of Socialism Live. Because as you know, guys, today is a banner day. It's an important day. I almost didn't do this stream today because I am so socialismed out. I have watched way too much socialism this month. We've all watched way too much socialism this month. I think it's starting to make me loopy. I think it's starting to drive me insane. But when you start something, it is important to finish it. And today we have our big culminating event for Red May. Because, you know, we couldn't come this far and then, oh, that's not the one I want. Oh, hang on. Wrong window. That's not the one I wanted to show you. We couldn't come this far without watching the last presentation that Red May is doing that I'm interested in. They're doing a makeup one on Bolivia. I am not interested in Bolivia or Chile, whatever. I don't like the socialist, like, international stuff that they do, so we're just going to pretend that this is the last presentation. As you guys know, if you have missed the glory that is Red May is a socialist group out in Seattle. When I say they're socialists, I mean they're really socialists. They call themselves socialists, communists, comrade, Marxists, etc. These are self-professed. These aren't like AOC socialists. These are not Bernie Sanders socialists. These are not CNN socialists. These are the real deal, the furthest of the far left. And every May, they do us the great and glorious service of providing us with a metric F-ton of socialist content live on the internet. Now, up until this point, we had not been watching socialism content to experience Red May live. We have watched their content from previous years for multiple Socialism Saturdays. But this year, I decided to stream as much Red May content as I could muster, and we've streamed a lot of it. I actually think that we have probably watched more Red May content than most of the people actually involved in Red May in real life. And of course, as we've been watching their content, we have graciously delivered Red May viewers that they would never have otherwise, for which I haven't even gotten a thank you. Seems really inconsiderate not to at least say thank you, Philip. But today, guys, we're going to watch the last presentation of Red May. It is called Late Fascism. How could I not watch the Late Fascism presentation? Even though it is at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, even though my morning was thrown completely off kilter with stuff I'm not going to talk about on the internet, even though this is an odd time and I have 2 other streams I need to do today, we have to see this through. We have to do it. And if Red May wants to deliver us a presentation starting in 7 minutes about late fascism, then I think we have to be here for it. So congratulations, guys. You have made it to the very end. Please mount that like button if you would be so kind. If you have missed any of the spectacular Red May Socialism Live content, it is, of course, all archived on this here YouTube channel. In addition to the regular socialist content that we do for Socialism Saturday every week. Yes, Gloria, Red May is coming. Well, May is coming to an end. It's going to be June. Red May is coming to a great and glorious end, and we're living for it. So let's see what we're watching today. This is a presentation called Late Fascism with Alberto Toscano, who is a reader in the critical theory department at the a reader in critical theory at the Department of Sociology, Goldsmiths University of London. It's always the Brits. The British always fuck things up. They really do. It is uncanny. Who co-directs the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought. He is a visiting faculty at the Digital Democracy Institute School of Communication, FSU. Oh, he's at FSU now. Oh, that's just great. We're also going to be listening to Nick Hale, who teaches at New York University. I almost went to NYU back in the day. Nah, bullet dodged. And is the founding faculty member of the NYU Prison Education Program. A historian of race, empire, and culture in the 20th century United States, Nick Hale is the author, most recently, of Race and America's Long War. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Black is a Country, Race and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy, and the author and editor of the Black Freedom Movement writing of Jack Odell, the new book, Reconstructing Democracy. Isn't that ominous? Reconstructing Democracy. Black Intellectuals in the American Century is the forthcoming from the University of California Press. His writing and historian interviews have appeared in a number of places, including New York Magazine, Time, The New Republic, and NPR. And lastly, we have Robin. Robin teaches at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, CUNY, which is the City University of New York, which means it's taxpayer funded by the citizens of New York. Congratulations. Her research has focused on the distinctive contributions of critical theory, Marxism, feminism, and psychoanalysis to the study of politics. You know, something that we really need to dig into more of, because we hear all the time, like, socialists are in love with Freud. They effing love Freud. I've always been a young person myself. I've been a young psychologist. I much prefer Carl Jung to Freud. For, I think, what are obvious reasons for anyone who understands. But socialists love Freud. And we know that a lot of socialists go to psychoanalytic school and they become psychoanalysts. And there are some socialists in Western Massachusetts who are doing psychoanalysis on trans children starting at 3 years old. I've documented that over on my Substack. That's a whole little fresh hell of its own over there. But I just think it's interesting how socialists are obsessed with Freud. I don't know why that is necessarily, why they gravitated to Freud, like why that's a thing. And I think that that's probably something that we should look into a little bit more in the future. Anyway, back to Robin. Robin's first book, The Highway of Despair, Critical Theory After Hegel. Oh, fun times. Reconstructs the emancipatory project of critical theory around the ideas of negative dialectics. Scheffler says, Marcuse, Eros, and Civilization is one of their Bibles. Yes, that is true as well, Scheffler. And I'm not reading that shit. I'll tell you that right now. You guys already have me reading transgender Marxism. I'm not going to read that, at least at the moment. All right, guys, so that's what we've got on the docket today. It should be getting started in about 3 minutes. But just as a reminder, this is not my first stream of the day. This is my first stream of the day. it will not be my last stream of the day. I have 2 more streams to do today, including a stream at 5 p.m. where we are going to talk about how queer is a political act, among other things. This is going to be my regular 5 p.m. stream. But if you would like a sneak preview, you can check out the article I posted on my Substack, Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com, called Queer is a Political Act. And you can get a sneak preview of what we are going to be watching and learning. This is actually from this past weekend, Socialism Saturday. We did a whole queer Marxism marathon, and it was one of the most intense Socialism Saturdays in the history of Socialism Saturday. And so I summed up the most important things people need to know about what the term queer actually means in that article. And that's available for free right now over on my Substack. And if you guys appreciate the work I'm doing, in addition to mounting that like button, in addition to making sure you are subscribed to this here YouTube channel, please also make sure you are subscribed to my Substack, which you can subscribe to for free. But if you want to fund the work I'm doing, I'm completely 100% funded by you, and you can do that at you can sign up for a paid subscription for $5 a month, $50 a year over on the Substack, and I really do appreciate it. Elena, thank you, Elena. Call it reparations. The British are making good. Listen, I like British people that are just nice and calm and come onto my channel to learn. I don't like British people that cause problems. Okay, Elena, you're good. You're good. Thank you, though. I really do appreciate it. So, guys, in addition to the 5 p.m. stream, of course, it is Tuesday evening, and well, it will be Tuesday evening, expeditiously. See, I'm still waking up. I still haven't even had my coffee yet. It was quite a morning, man. I'll tell you what. And so in addition to the 5 p.m. stream that I will be doing at 5 p.m., we will also be gathering later tonight for Nothing Remotely Controversial at 9:30 p.m. with Joshua. You all know you come for Joshua, and I'm just happen to be there. So we do news and we do tarot cards and we do psychic stuff, and it's fun and it's a way to blow off steam, and it's a really fun kind of way to just kind of like make fun of this reality in which we find ourselves in. So you'll be able to find us on the channel at 9:30 p.m. tonight with Joshua as well. And now we're just waiting for Red May to get started. Let me set up the sound. Will it be Philip? Will Philip take us out today? Will it be Sean, who is the most, I hope it's Sean, the most handsome of all socialists. Or it could be Kyle. We don't know. We'll see. Sid the Cat, you're also in England? See, now I feel bad about insulting people in England. I'm sorry. Okay, guys, we're getting started. Let's do it. We made it. Philip!
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Red
Hi,
May, your
Philip.
1 month vacation from capitalism. And that month is now winding down. We are on our last 2 events. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., we have the legal crisis in Chile with Gerardo Munoz, Alejandra Castillo, and Rodrigo Carmi.
Oh, bingo. I'll get you guys a bingo card.
Tune into that. And today we're going to discuss late fascism, a kind of return of the repressed again. It keeps coming back and back like in a zombie movie. Here's
your bingo
I'd
card
like
if you want it.
Our panel. Let's just get right into the discussion. The name of the panel is taken from a new book coming out by Alberto Toscano, which is called Late Fascism. It's from Verso, coming out in October. Alberto, is that?
Verso, socialist book
fingers
publisher.
Crossed here. And Alberto has crossed the ocean and moved from was it Goldsmiths to Simon Fraser.
Correct.
Alberto, of course, is the author of books like Cartography of the Absolute and Fanaticism, which may enter the discussion today in some way. Who knows? Our other 2 panelists quickly are Robin Marasco, a political scientist and theorist.
Oh God,
from
doesn't
Hunter,
Robin look like a socialist? Holy
called
shit.
The Highway of Despair.
I don't think we should have. Oh no, we're already having microphone problems. Philip, get it together.
No, actually,
come on.
We love Hegel. So
we don't love Hegel, Philip.
Great interpreters of it. And lastly,
could Robin look like any more of a socialist?
Nikhil Singh, who is at I get this wrong. I always miss between CCNY and NYU, but it's NYU, right?
Right.
Robin is at CUNY,
and you're sort of
Mikhail
in the
is at
English department, but
NYU,
also in
and
the
Alberto
prison
is a
program.
visiting professor at San
And you
Francisco
are the
University.
author of
Robin does all socialists
Black
look
as a
miserable,
Country
Bob.
and Race and American Foreign Policy. Is that the? Have I got it almost right there?
None of it right, but that's okay.
Oh God. Okay.
Way to go,
God, they
Philip.
should get someone who really knows how to introduce people here.
You
instead
should
of
have
me.
had Sean
I'll
do
just
it,
turn over
Philip.
to Alberto, and we can get into the meat of the program instead of the frivolous intro.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Philip, and thanks a lot to Robin and Nikhil for joining me in this conversation. So I thought I would just
anymore. This is going to be
start
a
by
day
saying
where
a few words.
they can ban me if they want to.
About the title of our panel and some of the rough coordinates of the book I've written, and then we can launch into a broader exploration.
Philip,
of this,
remember to mute your
alas,
mic.
all too topical theme. So the origins of the book are probably obvious enough to everyone. The kind of circulation and inflation even of the term fascism in popular discourse and debate, most obviously, perhaps, certainly in this context in the US, but certainly by no means exclusive to that situation. We have discussions of the relevance and of the threats of fascism, ranging from contemporary Brazil to Turkey. Recently, the pages of Haaretz even were declaiming the presence,
Philip,
indeed,
mute.
quasi-hegemony of fascist trends within Israel, and so on and so forth. And of course, accompanying this, there's been a lively, if perhaps one might somewhat polemically argue, rather limited debate about the relevance of 20th century theories and histories of fascism to the present,
Robin,
which is largely, I think,
why
been
are we
somewhat
discussing
trapped
fascism
by a
2
problem
p.m. on a Tuesday?
which not
Why?
only myself but others
With
have seen as the
socialists.
problem of analogy. So to what extent can we draw effective parallels and similarities between the present conjuncture, and a largely European-defined interwar moment? And that has often involved the effort to draw up checklists or schedules for the rise or the consolidation of fascism that have, of course, drawn, amongst other things, on certain, we could argue, somewhat streamlined or schematized and sometimes commonsensical and sometimes rather caricatural notions of what European historical fascisms meant, and also have involved largely ignoring other global histories of fascism, from Japan to Latin America to all sorts of other contexts, which were coeval, right, with the emergence of fascism in Italy and Germany. And so my aim, I suppose, in the book was to respond, as one does in writing books, to a certain irritation or dissatisfaction with this question of analogy, and return to both classic, so to speak, theoretical debates on fascism in the 1930s and 40s, but also perhaps more controversially or provocatively to revisit and in some sense to revalorize the kind of debates on new fascisms that emerged in the wake of global liberation movements in the late 60s and 70s, debates that often took the form of a discussion of the new fascism. And again, these had really a global reach. Some of the most interesting debates, which alas, I do not touch on the book, but I would like to in the future, the debates that took place in Latin America, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, about relationship between fascism and dependency, military dictatorships and neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. So there's a very rich, and I think in many ways not so carefully explored archive of these theories that I think we would do well to return to, and perhaps to suspend the tendency to analogize or directly disanalogize with fascism, and to think of fascism as a process, to think also, and this is where I think the contribution of Black radical and anti-colonial theories of fascism is absolutely vital, to think of the various forms of fascisms before fascism, and indeed the various forms of fascism that inhabited and were inoculated into colonial regimes, and indeed the post-colonial liberal democracies that were the descendants and inheritors of those regimes themselves. And so part of the proposal of the book is that we turn to authors like Du Bois, like George Jackson and Angela Davis, discussing the question of fascism in the US from the vantage point of the position of imprisoned Black liberation militants and so on and so forth, to dislocate a little bit a tendency which I think is very comforting for liberals and very damaging for leftists, which is to create this very streamlined notion of fascism and to present it as the threat of a return of something that we already know and already recognize, to which we already know the antidote. The antidote being some disturbingly watered down version of a kind of anti-fascist popular front, which mainly involves a sort of last-ditch effort to defend the status quo. So maybe before I pass the proverbial mic on to Robin and Nikhil, I was maybe
really good
should
point,
say
Benjamin.
something about this question of lateness. In one sense, the late, of course, resonates with another fairly famous expression amongst Marxists, at least the expression late capitalism, which, of course, in itself can be read in all sorts of different registers. And surely, and others, including Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen in his book, Late Capitalist Fascism, have developed the possible interaction between these concepts, right? So what would a fascism that is not a fascism emerging in the heyday of industrial capitalism over an industrial manufacturing working class mean? What is fascism in periods of intense financialization? What is fascism in a period of the decay and the sovereignty and power of the nation state, and so on and so forth? I also mean lateness, perhaps in a different vein, which is the sense of both the presence of distinctly fascist phenomena and rhetorics and desires and modalities, but also what seems to be their anachronism, their being in some sense out of time. The idea that fascism as both a mass movement and a political economic project to dominate a capitalist state, to quash working class insurgencies, to prolong imperial projects and colonial projects, is something that bears little clear connection to our own moment.
Philip is
and
a
of course,
wee bit,
I guess we could also add to that.
this.
Of
He
course,
doesn't like it.
fascism
Philip believes in
its
private property.
classic form in the 20s and 30s also had to do with its own forms of lateness, right? The lateness of Italy and Germany to the colonial and imperial project, the coming after the Russian and other revolutions, and of course fascism's own obsession with lateness understood as decadence, decay, and so on and so forth. So I think all of those things are somewhat at play, but I wanted to stress what seems to be both a kind of ubiquity of fascist themes and modes, which make a lot of sense of the circulation of this term in all sorts of very different political contexts, but also the sense that there is a kind of profound anachronism or profound disjuncture between some of the classic forms of fascism and the present, But lastly, I do think that in order to study that lateness, or to think about that lateness, to think about what fascism after fascism might mean, that we also have to be attentive to something that in different ways I think both Robin and Nikhil have studied and foregrounded, which is the forms of fascisms, in a sense, before fascism, right? Whether the seeding of fascism in settler, colonial, and imperial forms of violence, or the presence of fascist potentials within the family, and so on and so forth. So those, I think, are also themes that are very important to draw on to expand our discussion and break it out of this deadlock, are we in the 1930s or not, which is really only benefits the Madeleine Albrights and Timothy Garton Ashes of this world, and obviously being in Red May, that's not our game. So I think I pass it over to Robin and then Nikhil. I think that was our sequence.
Lovely, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Terrific. So first, I just want to thank Alberto and Nikhil for the invitation to sit on this panel.
Distracted by
I've been reading both of you and listening to you and thinking with you from a distance for several years
Carlin,
now. And so it's an absolute honor to be on this panel. And thank you, Alberto, for your work, for your recent work, and the manuscript forthcoming book that this panel sort of launches or kind of anticipates. I just want to pick up on a few themes that Alberto has raised for us and kind of develop them in a different way or along a different kind of set of inquiries. But first, let me also just continue in the spirit of flattery and acknowledge Alberto's kind of contributions to our thinking and rethinking of the tasks of critical theory. And I mean this on sort of two levels.
Theory.
First, the kind of
race theory.
The integration of a serious scholarly enterprise with a kind of sincere and profound public engagement, and in which neither is sort of compromised for the other, I think is a real model for sort of all of us. And so I appreciate this sort of invitation to think our present in a very dynamic way that builds upon a kind of deep scholarly knowledge and advances it without necessarily getting kind of mired in it, so to speak. And then I might say that the other thing that Alberto's work invites us to do is think expansively about what critical theory is and the resources from which it can draw. And so as I've tried to think expansively about critical theory in its dialogue with especially psychoanalytic and feminist traditions, I have appreciated Alberto's effort to kind of think expansively about critical theory as it sort of assimilates and also is sort of challenged and provoked and rethought by especially anti-colonial thought and the Black radical tradition. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge in general the contribution to the kind of contemporary tasks of critical theory. And I might want to just sort of think about what I
great point,
take
Benjamin.
to be my
calendar
own
is very
challenge
capitalist.
and my own thinking through these contemporary, the sort of contemporary task or challenge for those of us who identify with this term, with this tradition, and with this intellectual practice. For me, critical theory in the kind of present, kind of contemporary conjuncture really involves an effort to think on the level of both history and structure, in which neither is kind of compromised for the other, neither is reduced to the other, and in which we don't kind of appeal to kind of a quick and like sloppy invocation of a dialectical relationship between these two. And so for me, some of the most profound meditations on this complex relationship of history and structure join together thinkers as diverse as Adorno and Althusser on the one hand, and Juliet Mitchell and Eve Sedgwick on the other. And so I'm really trying to think about expansively how can this kind of broad tradition of critical theory allow us to think on sort of on both levels. And so I'm quite interested in the histories of fascism, the question of continuity and discontinuity, of analogizing and disanalogy, but I'm also quite interested in what some thinkers might have gestured toward in thinking about some of the structural conditions of fascism, or sort of some of the structural kind of features of fascism. And so for me, it's been a very difficult and tricky effort to kind of keep hold of kind of both sides. And so it's in that context, my own thinking, that I want to follow up on aspects of what Alberto's sort of recent work, I think, highlights for us and allows us to think about. The first, I think, sort of postulate or position that we find in Alberto's work that is especially useful for my own thinking is this idea of fascism as a process, not as a singular kind of state of being. And I'm quite interested in how fascism as a process activates and is activated by existing institutions which operate perhaps in semi-autonomy from the state, but precisely on its behalf. And some of my recent work has been especially interested in the family as a
I'm going to be doing a
singular,
thing on that later. I'm
maybe
going to do a
even
story on that later.
paramount
We'll talk about it on the stream. Thank you, Niraj, for sending that to me.
Fascist activation for its central role in a capitalist mode of production and reproduction, the key role of the family in neoliberal politics and political economy. We can sort of think of the work of Melinda Cooper in this regard, but also the central role of the family in the history of racial capitalism in producing the idea of race and reproducing the idea of racial purity. And so one of the things that's interesting for me is that the family kind of sits right at the center of these, you could say, dual projects and dual processes that we might identify with the fascist process, which has to do with political economy and racialization. I might also propose that we think about the family as a seat of power, where both authority and sovereignty are assimilated into the human experience, and for that reason might be central to fascist politics. And so when I talk about authority and sovereignty, I'm especially thinking about some of both the long arc of Juliet Mitchell's work on the family, but some of the more recent work on what she describes as the sibling trauma and the relationship of the sibling trauma to the constitution of the family. In short, I think Mitchell is inviting us to think about family dynamics across both the kind of vertical and kind of horizontal.
That's a really good observation, Sin.
And she's suggesting that a particular form of what she sees as sociality, but we might describe as politics, emerging along that kind of vertical and horizontal axis, the sort of vertical axis being the axis of authority, right, which is a certain kind of perhaps preparation for authoritarianism without collapsing one into the other. We could say that it is along the vertical axis that a certain assimilation of authority takes place, and it is for Mitchell along the horizontal axis where friends and enemies get demarcated, especially through the sibling trauma, right? And for Mitchell, mothers precisely preside over this horizontal axis. You might think in sort of Schmittian terms of the sort of this is the axis of sovereignty. Whether we sort of buy that general analytic or not, I'm quite interested in not only the way that fascist politics kind of sits at the intersection of a capitalist political economy and a kind of a process and politics of racialization, but also how the fascist problematic, if you'll forgive me that term, kind of opens at the intersection of authority and sovereignty, or the intersection of this
that doesn't mean
vertical
anything.
axis and this kind of
None of this
horizontal
means anything.
axis. I think both of which are kind of assimilated, or at least introduced into
This is complete word salad.
the
Am I
human
wrong?
condition in the family. And so it's for these reasons, just to give a sketch, that we might think about the centrality of the family. For both the kind of
fucking hell, there it is.
historically
The centrality
about
of
our,
the family.
there
it
the
is.
contemporary
Every
conjuncture, but also
time.
thinking structurally
Every damn time.
about some of the aspects of fascist politics that kind of get activated in
the
our
family is
kind of
central in
enduring and
fascist
most durable
politics.
institutions.
Hang on.
Like
God
the
damn
family.
these people. I swear to
and then
God.
this is the final sort of point I might make, or final substantive point, which concerns this notion of a kind of fascism before fascism, or a kind of fascism that precedes fascism, which I think Alberto has very provocatively and rightly invited us to think in terms of a colonial experience that precedes the kind of European experience of fascism, which is mistakenly taken to be a kind of singular and extraordinary appearance of the thing. And I think Alberto's perspective is absolutely right on this idea of a curious kind of fascism that precedes fascism. For me, we would have to think not only historically and globally then about that fascism before fascism, but also maybe developmentally and psychoanalytically about the kind of seeds of a fascist character that take form
seeds of a fascist character
in the family,
really,
perhaps even
they take form in the family,
in the neoliberal family, given the extraordinary pressures placed upon it.
Oh
and
my
so
God.
I guess in closing, I would make my final plea for a feminist tradition that I think contributes its own
feminism without family. That's the name of Sophie Lewis's book.
To how we might think
Feminists
about late
against
fascism.
the family.
And I don't only mean a Marxist feminist tradition that took the family and the bourgeois patriarchal family as a key mode of production and reproduction. But I also mean a radical feminist tradition
bourgeois family
that saw in the patriarchal family what they described as a kind of sexual fascism.
Means
really
of
wanted to think in relationship to racial terror and
they all
sort of
hate
global,
the family. This is insane.
U.S. imperialism. So I might just maybe even make a plea for kind of expanding our kind of archive of anti-fascist critical theory to include precisely those feminists who understood that the family sat at the seat of both the most repressive forms of kind of capitalist politics, but also the production of their most violent pleasures. Thank you.
I want to echo Robin and express my thanks to both Robin and Alberto for asking me to participate in this discussion. I'm great admirers of both of your work.
This is the NYU
and we are gathered here on the occasion of being able to kind of preview Alberto's book before a lot of people are going to get to read it. But it's a really, really important book, and it's going to be very, very helpful in clarifying what has become a difficult discussion over the last several years. I just want to say a note also of thanks to Philip Woolsetter and to the organizers of Red May, who have me back every year. And it really is one of the
look at what's going on in the chat.
Wonderful gatherings of our
Wonderful
disparate
points
left
about the
kind
family.
of
Authority and sovereignty made me think of
community. And
discourses
I
of
wish we were
parenting,
all
and those
meeting each
discourses
other in
relate to
person and had a
class, race,
chance
and
to really
gender.
spend
In
more
other
time
words,
together.
to what
But
extent
this will
is
have to
a
do for
good
now.
parent
So
supposed
thank you,
to
Philip.
instill sovereignty in their
So when I
child, and how
say
to
this has been a
mediate or
difficult
disguise their
discussion, I'm
authority?
thinking really of my own kind of struggles to wrestle with this signifier fascism and the challenges of what we might call kind of specification, right? Which I think leads us to think about fascism in terms of typologies and analogies, right? In the way that Alberto has kind of rightly cautioned us against, and that we have to have a kind of a checklist to sort of to sort of say, yes, this is fascism, right? And then it leads us into these kinds of historical dead ends where it becomes almost impossible to say anything that's really interesting about what's happening now. But on the other hand, I think we have the opposite problem from specification, which is kind of inflation of fascism, and an inflation of the threat of fascism, in fact, in the
You don't
ways in
say.
which particularly liberal kind of anti-fascists have taken up the term, especially in the period since Trump emerged.
He's ragging on Antifa.
So we have to remember that liberal anti-fascism is the dominant tradition in the United States since World War II.
They don't like Antifa.
And so that has to be something that we think about when we think about the way this debate gets shaped in the United States.
That was surprising.
And I think
didn't see that coming.
Alberto's book really offers us a way through this problem of kind of over specification through analogy or through a kind of exceptionalizing of fascism that is always found wanting when you try to compare what's happening now to the real thing, and to a kind of inflated account that finds fascism kind of sort of growing, metastasizing, despite the fact that the mundanities of American politics continue. And I think the way he finds through this is one, to kind of reiterate something Robin has said, to think of fascism as a process, and to think of how we relate fascism both as something that exists in relationship to capitalism broadly and to kind of the structural
Fascism is related
requisites
to
of the
capitalism.
economy, but also that exceeds those through kind of various psychopolitical valences that conscript people into authoritarian politics and desire.
And it
So that's kind of
conscripts people
one
into
sort of
authoritarian
broad
politics.
sort of element that I think we
Fascism
can think
equals
of when we think of
capitalism equals
fascism as a
authoritarianism, is what he
process.
just said.
But then more specifically, through the genealogies of racial fascism, colonial fascism,
Racial
what is called-
fascism, what's that?
what Alberto has called fascism before fascism, and what the Black radical tradition
Slavery. Racial
long
fascism.
named
Slavery.
as racial terror
Got it.
before fascism emerged as a kind of formal political movement and a set of politics that then became kind of the reference point. So I think that those two moves in the book are really, really valuable for us, and really we can talk about them further in the question and answer, and kind of elaborate what those are about. So I want to just kind of use the rest of my remarks to sort of think a little bit about fascism in the U.S. context, because I am a historian of the United States, and I think Alberto's book is not pitched this way exactly, because he's really trying to think about a kind of global frame for the emergence of far-right movements. But there is something about the US in this discussion, particularly the critique of racial fascism, that has long been a concern of mine. So a couple of years ago on Twitter, I offered this kind of quip. And I just quote myself from Twitter. I'm no longer active on Twitter, but you can still find this account, and you can search any of these tweets if you want to. So I asked, why is there no socialism in the United States? That was the common question. That
you think there's no socialism in the United States?
And one of the answers, or
really
composite answer that's given to that question, is a racially and regionally fractured, institutionally weak, craft union dominated labor history. That's just sort of a simple answer. But we rarely ask the question,
What does
why
that
is there
mean?
no fascism in the United States? But that might be considered a corollary question to the why is there no socialism in the United
Well.
States? The answer to both of these, in short, is something like the liberal tradition or the dominance of a liberal tradition. But I gave this answer: slavery, segregation, settler colonialism, race wars, nativism. In short, fascism in the United States is redundant. So that gets close to a kind of colloquial, sort of setting for the Black radical response to fascism as it emerged in World War II, which was essentially to say, as Langston Hughes did, that we have been suffering fascism long before fascism was called fascism, and something that Hughes went on to
Have they
describe
defined
as our
fascism yet?
native fascisms, that is, the forms of racial terror that had circulated throughout US history from its inception.
I don't think they have.
But I want to add something to this kind of immediate post-war context. The post-war US far right, or the wartime, or let's
How are
say
you defining the far right?
the US far right in the World War II period and emerging out of World War II was always Nazi curious. And
How are we
that may
defining the
be
far
one
right?
of the main misconceptions of the fascism discussion as it unfolds today. Since these people already understood the family resemblances, much like those on the other side of the debate, the anti-fascists, especially the Black anti-fascists, they already understood that there was a relationship that existed between what was emerging in interwar Europe as fascist movements and the racist far right in the United States. And much of contemporary US history, that is in the current moment that we live in, is watching the intense anti-Nazi propaganda campaign launched by the US government at the outset of World War II lose its grip on conservative elites who have returned to this kind of earlier formation. It's this kind of breaking of taboos that Trump represented. And in many ways, Trump represented a kind of return to this kind of World War II era, far right, kind of racist, isolationist kind of vision of the world, right? That was, as I said, Nazi curious and sympathetic to some
How
of
was
the
Trump Nazi
aspects of what was
curious?
happening on the far right at that period. And I want to quote from a letter that Claire Booth Luce wrote to Henry Luce. So
I
Henry
do know
Luce,
what the
you
far
may
right
know,
is. I have
is the
discussed the far
author of
right
the
on many,
famous
many, many
Manifesto,
occasions.
The
And the
American
right, they
Century,
absolutely
which is
does
often
exist. They're
considered
called
to
Christian
be a
nationalists
kind of a blueprint
and white
for
identitarians.
American
But
cosmopolitanism
that's not what they're
after
talking
World
about.
War II. Luce is imagining a world based upon free trade, the end of empires, the circulation of automobiles and American jazz, which he sort of appropriates, right?
American
And of course,
jazz.
Luce has his own weird racial politics, and he's an old line American elite, and he's very, very invested in the Chinese nationalists and other aspects of what's going on in different parts of the world that are going to impact his politics going forward. But the American Century is really often taken as this kind of quintessential liberal document of kind of how the United States' globalism is going to look different from what came before. And he's answered with a long letter from his wife, Claire. And Claire is an interesting figure in her own right, but she begins, "My darling Henry." And I think this is interesting in light of the kind of family romance that sort of Robin points us to. So what she
Teresa,
says
I
in
just
that letter
explained to you
is,
what it
and
is.
I'll quote a little
White
bit now,
identitarians, Christian
"America will
nationalists.
survive
I'm
as a
going to write
nation
a post
only
about
if she
them on the
preserves the
Substack later
racial and
today.
cultural
They
homogeneity,
don't know what it
predominantly
is. I do
Anglo-Saxon,
know what it is.
which until 1850 anyway, made her America. This is a matter of strict barriers against further immigration of brown, black, and
And they don't
yellow
like Trump
peoples,
at all.
and a desperate attempt to keep out the scum and sweepings of South Europe, the Levantine East, and Asiatic Russia." It's quite a compass. She goes on, "Nations are the most cannibalistic of human organisms, and many have been interested of stripping us, killing us and then devouring us to grow fat, sleek, healthy, rich, and strong by the same process that Great Britain and ourselves have grown. But Great Britain, and in colonial days ourselves,
No,
have
the real
generally
far right does
preferred
not like
to
Trump at
eat
all.
black,
They really
brown,
don't.
and yellow meat to white meat. And now that they have us on the ground, their teeth sunk into us, they see an opportunity that we must be prepared to fight against. She concludes her letter. So I am a fascist, I suppose, because I believe with all my heart and mind that the war with Germany is folly and that it will weaken us horribly. I'm sorry, this is very faded what I have here. To face our next centuries, and that to face those enemies who are yellow and brown, we must face them as white men who created the Parthenon, Rems, Rockefeller Center, Plato, and Shakespeare, and not as New Deal pinks. And all that is that, and I am now signing off the loose network for the duration. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing collection of things in that thing, right? I mean, it's a kind of a geopolitical racial map. It's a kind of erotics of a kind of perverse erotics of kind of racial dispossession and kind of what that is imagined in terms of kind of feeding the vitality of the kind of devouring body. And then, of course, it ends in this sort of prosaic place talking about New Deal pinks. And of course, the pinks are the sort of effeminate and perhaps
what a great way to
sexually
describe them.
deviant progressives who who believe that we can all produce a kind of beneficent, harmonious, and inclusive social order. It's all the elements that you still see, right, within the kind of circulating discourse of contemporary fascism. So the American far right has always been fascist curious. I think we shouldn't ever think that we have not been living with fascists in the United States.
What does it mean to be fascist
And we should
curious?
never think that fascism has not always been about a kind of racial logic that's been understood as both inwardly and outwardly directed, right? Inwardly
I'm
directed
asking if they've ever been on
the
Gab.
control of indigenous and exogenous others, coming from the frontier and the plantation, through the sort of modalities of segregation and Jim Crow and Indian removal and so forth. And outer directed in the expansionist urge, right, to think about the United States as a nation that will, in fact, always be, in some ways, an empire. And so those elements of US history are, I think, ones that we have never really internalized into a kind of a clear understanding of what the United States actually is. Not really a nation state, but a kind of empire state, one that sees itself as possessing the capacities to sort of supersede the more bounded and kind of narrow version of European imperialism, in part due to its own sort of internal experience with racial technologies and its ability to employ them effectively, right? And I think that really raises a last point that I want to make, which is that, and this sort of gets back to where I began.
No,
about the
it is
idea
not
that maybe to
different.
talk
They're
about
the far
fascism
right.
in
If
the
you
United
think that
States is
Christian
redundant
nationalists
in
are
a
just
sense,
proud of
where
the
we
country,
come
you're
to it
wrong.
from
I'm
the
sorry,
standpoint
Teresa.
of the
That is not
fascism
correct.
before fascism.
It's not
a
correct at all.
federalism that was designed in part to precisely do what Alberto describes following Sartre and Jair Spinaggi as a governance via the manipulation of seriality, the kind of the fragmentation of collectivities that then can be sort of directed, right, according to the needs of a counter-revolutionary regime of property ownership, right, through not a centralized authority, right, not a centralized government, but through this kind of very effective process of delegation that Robin is referring to.
What?
A delegation that operates in the family, a delegation that operates through local jurisdictional policing, a delegation that operates through the kind of manifold tributaries of counterinsurgent power that get kind of spread around the world after World War II. There is an American strategy and technique that operates differently. And I think that's one of the reasons
property
why
ownership?
the kind of image of fascism has been so elusive and difficult to understand. It's not about the kind of consolidation of centralized authority. It's about the formations of what we might call decentralized despotism, right? Colonialism always operated through modalities of indirect rule and delegated authority.
They're saying
right?
the
So
colonialization
in some
operates
ways, we
through
might
property
think
ownership.
of
Okay, I got
contemporary
it.
fascism or late fascism
Property
coming
ownership.
back to
That's
its
what
sort
they
of
fucking mean
truer
by
form,
fascism.
right?
Property
The
ownership.
management
Private
of
property.
colonial
Got it.
capitalism.
Colonial
Being the
capitalism
kind
equals
of
private
the kind
property
of form through which
equals
fascism
fascism.
maybe emerges in its
You
kind of
just said it.
its kind of in the European conflagration.
Well, that's our definition of
that
fascism,
lasts
guys.
for that
Private
period of time
property
and kind
ownership.
of exhausts itself, but that doesn't exhaust the fascist processes that have been central to the management of capitalism as a set of colonial forms and patriarchal forms and racial forms. And if we understand it that way, which is, I think, what I get from Alberto's book, not from my own thinking, but really from reading and thinking through the work that I just read, then I think we maybe are on a better kind of ground with this discussion in terms of kind of understanding what we're facing and what we're trying to address now. So I'll stop there because I've probably gone on long enough and we want to have some time to talk.
Well, Philip is trying to come back in. Sorry.
Come back in, Philip.
I'm
To
trying.
prompt
Ask
us
some
to
questions,
further
Philip.
thought.
Wow. I mean, so I think we all absolutely endorse Nikhil's elegant portrayal of what
I don't
of the
endorse
history
it.
of America, as opposed to it's precisely the history that Ron DeSantis is trying to erase in Florida.
Oh, they're
So
afraid of Ron DeSantis.
what we're dealing with is not
Oh,
an
that's
arrival of
interesting, isn't it?
fascism, but a coming out of a fascist substratum. The first question is, why now? Why would it be coming out now at a time when
No one asked that
the
question,
left
Philip.
is not particularly strong compared to other times when, say, original fascism
Literally, no one
had
asked that
its
question.
heyday in Europe, where it was interpreted as a strategy of capital to deal with mass politics. Why is this substratum coming out now in America at this time?
I may not answer it for America as such, but I think there's a really interesting question that puzzled me in the writing of the book, and I'm not entirely sure that the writing of the book resolved for me, which is this problem of what is a counter-revolution without a revolution, right? Of course, some of the more lucid theorists of fascism, Polanca's being one, but indeed, actually, George Jackson echoes him in Blood in My Eye, I think, note that, of course, even classical fascism is not an immediate counter-revolution, right? Classical fascism comes on the scene after a defeat of revolutionary forces, right? After the defeat of the workers' councils in Italy, and with a longer extension after the defeat of the German revolutions of 1919, 1923, and we could go on, right? Of course, those threats then remained: massive workers' movements, Third International, etc. So how do we diagnose that now, right? And I think there's a number of ways of doing it. Of course, there's the strange symptom which I think in the United States, but also elsewhere, is particularly striking, especially for people on the left, is the fantasy or the projection that what, of course, many leftists have been criticizing as watered down compromises of liberal institutions aimed at defanging any form of radical challenge, diversity, equity, inclusion, mandatory programs, universities, etc., are actually then perceived as spearheads of this, diffuse but dominant, right, Marxist threat.
It is the spearhead. Well, no, it's not in the
know,
universities. It's in the public schools. That's the threat.
Rick Scott doing these travel warnings. It's all like pantomime sort of theater, but at the same time, there is also a kind of core
they're basically saying, guys, we're not really infiltrating your institutions. We're not doing it. It's all
now. What does that
theory.
stand in for?
You're all
given
crazy.
that clearly,
sure, okay, yeah.
DEI seminars at the State Department are not the sign of the victory of anti-imperialism, right? So what is this about? And on one level, you could say, well, it's a response to protracted, deep, diffuse social crises that are entirely unresolved by the forms of neoliberal and capitalist governance we experience. That's one element, right? That you could say, well, is diverted then into the racialized pseudo pro-worker rhetorics of so many different fascisant movements around the world. Then I think there is another dimension, which is the response to real, insurgencies and real or threats that feel real, right? George Floyd rebellion, the
George Floyd rebellion, they called it that again. We heard that last time too.
However thwarted or truncated
the
in
George
other places
Floyd
over
rebellion.
The past 10 years. And I think lastly, and I don't think this is insignificant, there is this ambient sense of closure, catastrophe, collapse, partly ecologically related, partly in terms of protracted crises of capitalism, that drives, right, a sense of an authoritarian solution that will at least defend the perceived privileges of some against their potential takers, right? And obviously this is why the question of migration is absolutely central, and why I think, as Brendan O'Connor rightly notes in his book, Blood Red Lines, that these are, the border fascism element is absolutely key, right? It's key across the board of many different contemporary phenomena. So I don't think there is one answer, certainly not one global answer, but there are a number of interlocking processes and crises that I think have made these moves much more attractive than they might have been. Having said that, in as much as fascism is viewed often, right, as a kind of like last resort of a beleaguered capitalist or bourgeois class that tries every other authoritarian result and then ultimately, makes this compromise and has this kind of sorcerer's apprentice problem. I don't think that's, that was one of the issues that I was dealing with in the book. There's not at all anything. There are, of course, a lot of capitalists, right? And there are a lot of fractions of capital that seem to be partly extractive capital, etc., that seem to be more drawn by authoritarian or fascistic solutions. But there isn't any sense of the homogeneity or convergence that you might have found, right, in the 1920s in Italy, or indeed the 1930s in Germany. So the functionality, right, of these superstructural moves to struggles within capitalism, I think, is much less linear. At least that's my impression at present, which is not to say that you couldn't have situations in which it would be even more attractive to a much more united front of business and capitalist interests. But that's just my own view. You're muted, Phil. Oh,
yeah, Robin or Nikhil, you want to respond?
I mean, to to the question of why now and why these fascist eruptions.
If it's worth pursuing further after what Alberto said, we can move on to the next question. What are you feeling?
I think I think many of the things that he raised are exactly right. These kind of ongoing crises. I think in the U.S. case, I think we also have to talk about particular elements of kind of everyday life that have been reorganized over the past 15 or 20 years. And
Like
I
what?
might be thinking here about both the kind of emergence of a kind of definable
Autumn,
and
this isn't a
politicized
dating
gun
club.
culture that has, made, in which kind of activists especially have made a quite concerted effort to put more and more guns into the hands of more and more people. And so thinking about especially the deputization of the use of violence under conditions of state constraint or the lack of state capacity or decentralization. I think we have to talk about guns and this also, I was sort of thinking about this in terms of what I think Nikhil rightly raised as the threat of violence. I mean, the threat of fascism and what we might think of as like the real threat of fascism versus the liberal fantasy of a threat of fascism. For me, the sort of everyday threat of fascism is the kind of everyday threat of gun violence that seems to me more and more part of our kind of everyday life. And so that seems to be kind of
I just
in the
asked,
mix.
do you think a
I might
society without
also
guns
think
is easier to
about,
stage a revolution in?
Without reducing any of this, any of these developments to technology or our relationship to technology, I think we undoubtedly have to talk about the networks of communication that were made possible by the internet, but also the specific kind of circuits of kind of desire and power and knowledge that were modeled there as well. And that seems to be kind of in the mix. And coupled with the kind of catastrophism or kind of looming threat of environmental collapse, I think these two things
threat
in
of
our present
environmental
moment
collapse.
really kind of come
This lady's
together
like
in
all
a
teed up.
particularly combustible way, right? Like the kind of technology and environmental collapse that seems, part of the mix. For me, the question of why now, I've been sort of thinking about, how,
the environment's going to collapse
why,
any moment, guys.
of course, did Dobbs happen right now? Like, why is it like, of course,
Because
this
you
is the
baited
moment
the right.
that Roe is overturned?
You baited them.
And so it's
That's
not
why.
so much about, like, why do we talk about fascism now?
I'm going to
But
say it.
why are the elements or features of our contemporary politics so obviously where the fascist project and process has kind of harnessed in our moment? So for me, it's not incidental that that a kind of a certain articulation of anti-wokeness gets coupled with a kind of a reactionary politics of transphobia and an assault on
This lady is
reproductive
throwing
rights.
all
It
the
doesn't seem
buzzwords
to me
in.
that these
She's
are
like every buzzword.
arbitrary aspects of our
Transphobia,
contemporary moment, but
anti-woke,
really essential to
abortion.
thinking about this kind of long flirtation with fascism on the right, this kind of long history of a kind of Nazi curious right wing in America.
How
but
are you
how
defining
it,
Nazi curious?
has sort of seized upon a particular set of issues in the contemporary conjuncture that actually help us to sort of understand what it is about right now. And so so it does seem to me that that reproduction as it relates to capitalist political economy and and a racial project in the United States is
Can't
quite
answer you right now,
quite
socialist. I have to
central
fix my
to what
knitting.
the now is. And so when we want to think in the direction of a more radical
My knitting is more important than you
anti-fascism,
social. Oh,
right,
he
to kind of
tweeted it. Oh,
oppose the
that's nice. Thank
liberal
you, Philip.
anti-fascism that is the dominant kind of
Philip is
post-war American
moderating my
tradition, it
enemies
seems
now.
to me that
Philip
we
and I are
also
friends,
have to be
basically. We're basically
sort of
best friends.
taking quite seriously the decisions from the Supreme Court. Some of the aspects of contemporary politics that we might have sort of thought about as kind of beyond our purview of concern. This is not to say that we should all assume that the Supreme Court is the only sort of location for consequential forms of political mobilization and decision making, but we have to, I think about how particular institutions that radicals have long either, I think, dismissed, right, or treated with a degree of suspicion, and I think correct suspicion, as we are now seeing. We have to, though, not simply kind of rest in the satisfactions of having always been right about the Supreme Court, right, or something along those lines, but sort of think
I wonder if she wants to
of
pack the
how
Supreme Court
an
or abolish
institution
the
like
Supreme
the
Court.
court can actually contribute to the process of fascization that I think Alberto is describing. So for me, the kind of why now is the question not so much of why fascism right now, but why are these issues? Of course, why is police violence, the assault on reproductive rights, transphobia, why are these, of course, the defining sort of issues of our moment?
Transphobia is not a defining issue of our moment. It's just something you complain about.
Yeah,
a lot.
I was going to ask a question of saying, suppose you're Marx, how would you write an 18th Brumaire of fascism to look at the farcical elements of what's going on? But after listening to Robin and Nikhil, this notion of this deadly serious fascist project that has been coextensive with America, I wonder if we could designate the liberal response as the farcical part, or the liberal wearing the clothes of anti-fascism in the so conspicuous a Roman senator way or whatever, as the only sort of element there.
Autumn, you literally just described socialism
as maybe as farcical.
That's
even
socialism.
Though there are elements of this fascism that are farcical, I guess, which we could talk about. But maybe the next question I have, and I don't want to go into typology, because I think every critique Alberto and everyone else has made of it is fine. I think Robin's notion of a process of fascistization that is sort of active at different times and very active now is, with all its dimensions, is much better, much easier to work with. But we hear about authoritarianism, we hear about Bonapartism. When we try to think about the right and the fractions of the right, and I think only in terms of understanding the conjuncture and figuring out how to deal with or fight with each fraction, or whether they can all be lumped together, how does one distinguish between the elements of the American right without falling into a pedantic academicism?
I like this question, Philip. Thank you.
I think I'll leave this to the US historian in the proverbial room.
Well, let me reframe it. Almost every right, from at least the political science, if you look at Chile, for example, the right has almost three fractions, which is a nationalist right, a Catholic integralist right, and a free marketeer's right, plus a genuine fascist, I'm talking about the Allende period, a genuine fascist street movement called Patria Libertad. They all ended up working together to overthrow Allende, which I guess is the important point. But if you look at Vichy France, it's divided between the Pétains people, which is the moral majority equivalent in France, the nationalists, the little agriculturalists. You have Laval, who was a big industrialist who wanted the communists gone, and you have the fascists of Paris, like Brasillac and so forth, who see themselves as part of a new European order led by the Nazis, which is modern and so forth. All I'm saying is, in almost all right movements, you can distinguish sort of goals. And I think in America for a time, people would say, all right, we have the neocons, we have the moral majority people, and we have the free marketers, and they all work together.
That's not
I mean,
right.
Is there any point of coming up with different
Hang
names?
on, Philip, there is no
Right,
universe.
or is the project coalescing in such a way? That's essentially what I'm asking. How do we avoid pedanticism, but be somewhat precise in how we use our picture, our portrait?
I understand the question. I think it's a hard one to answer. And maybe I'll just refer back to the previous question a little bit by saying, I think one of the things that always puzzles me right now is, when you have like Ron DeSantis going all in on kind of outflanking Trump from the right, and picking fights with Disney, right? So the large corporate entities have no interest seemingly in this project of the right. They really have no interest, particularly in limiting reproductive freedom. They have no interest in not continuing the trajectories of a kind of mild and harmonious kind of discourse of racial diversity. They certainly have no interest in the mass dissemination of firearms to every individual who is 18 and older. It just doesn't make sense, right? So there is something about the way in which the right's kind of biopolitics and the fourth thing would be that they have no interest in continuing to limit immigration. Moral majority
and free marketers.
The big corporate entities, particularly highly skilled immigration. They want the United States to continue to basically suck talent especially from India and China. And these are the right's has become somewhat successful now in limiting some of these things. I mean, through the Supreme Court, but also through some new political consensus that's emerging between, I think, the right and the center. So,
no,
and I think the term fascization is a good term because it does sort of set in motion certain kinds of processes, certain kinds of educative, pedagogical, subject forming kinds of processes, right? And so when you look at the far right and the kinds of things they float, they're positively scary, right?
What is
as a naturalized citizen of the United States, when I see people talking about the idea that naturalization post 1965, is not legitimate. An idea that comes out of the Claremont Institute. You sort of
I actually tend to agree with him on that.
it
Trump is being a moron by pushing this. He really is.
These are the kinds of trial balloons, and we've seen the realization of some of the most extreme plans when you now have 6-week abortion bans and you have the sort of movement towards banning at the state level along many different fronts in the kind of gender, sexuality, and education realms, right? So there are scary aspects to the right's agenda that seem to be far more militant than they once were, and I think we would be mistaken not to sort of take that really seriously. But on the other hand, it does seem very disarticulated from any kind of political economic program or any kind of ability to master really the heterogeneity of social forces that exist in the United States. So this kind of goes beyond the question of the particular fractions of the right to the actual unruly, ungovernable character of American heterogeneity itself. I mean, it's actually weirdly the one thing that I sometimes take some kind of solace in. Like when I travel around the country and I go to places that people imagine as like, you know, I don't know, red states or whatever, and you go into any like mall and you see every single different kind of humanity in that place.
You don't see anyone in a
And
mall.
yeah, there's a mass
No
shooting
one
every
goes to
day in
malls
some part of the
anymore.
country. But also
What are you
there's
talking about?
most of the
I was in a
time
mall a month ago and
a
no one was
mass of
there.
different kinds of people gathering in different places
Fucking mall?
everywhere, every
This guy
single
hasn't been in a
day.
mall in years. I'll tell you what.
And
Have any of you been in a
maybe
mall
not
in
with
years?
full conviviality and connection, because of course we are isolated and atomized, but certainly with some kind of benign indifference for the most part.
Like no one goes
Like
to
people
malls
don't
anymore.
want to be at war with each other, I don't think. So, but the right wants us to be at war with each other, and they want to kind of stoke that kind of race war mentality at every turn. And I think there's got to be some kind of counter programming that starts to happen that is very, very different from the kind that progressives tend to offer.
Are you suggesting the right
Because
needs to be
progressives
sent to the
tend to
gulag,
respond to the
Mikhail?
right with their own kind of sort of soft authoritarianism, whether it's, you know, you can't say that, you know, like I had a whole conversation in my my class this term where the students all think that we're in the process of experiencing a genocide of trans people in this country.
Holy shit!
And I'm like, well, can we interrogate this idea that there is a genocide of trans people happening in this country? There is not a genocide of trans people happening in this country right now. There may be people who want to eliminate all trans people from the public sphere. Absolutely, that's a central part of our politics.
Thank you, Nikhil.
But there's also
smart thing you've said all
an
day.
embrace of gender-affirming care by the administration. There's an embrace of transgender medicine within the dominant organs of the medical establishment.
No, that's not true. They're banning it in Europe
in the
for
public
minors.
schools. In the place where I live, there's tremendous efforts to teach tolerance and diversity and gender fluidity and et cetera, et cetera. My point being not that we've simply won this battle, but that if we think of this in terms of kind of the right being all powerful in this moment, I think we also miss something that's really important about what our politics need to be in confronting the actual threat that we face, and the way in which the kind of progressive framings are often wanting in the face of it, right? So I'd like to talk more about that, but I won't say any more right now because I've now gone on at length.
Maybe just to riff on Nikhil's point briefly, because I really appreciate how he's framed it, but it also makes me think about the significance of the state and imaginaries of the state to these contemporary formations, right? And the strangely mimetic character of it, right? So I was struck, I mean, forcing myself to wade into these awfully distorted conceptions of Gramsci that various, intellectual minnows on the far right entertain, largely based on cribbed fake citations from the internet. But nevertheless, what drew their attention, and I think that in itself was interesting and symptomatic, was this idea, rather shakily attributed to Gramsci himself, about the long march through the institutions, right? And in fact, the whole paranoid, anti-Semitic cultural Marxism theory has then projected onto the federal government based on this notion that somehow, the left, defeated on the streets, defeated in the factories, had won in the state, right? In the state, and of course, crucially, in the domains of pedagogy.
I'm so glad we watched this. This is great.
And that therefore, they needed to imagine themselves, and this is, the bread and butter of, national conservatism and the kind of urbanization of the American right has to do with that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. It's really interesting because it's actually not, it's not the return to the state in the imperial outer directed mode of neoconservatism, right? Which we know from the Iraq War and its predecessors, etc. It's a very different formation, right? It's not drawing on those aggressive foreign policy Democrats or anything like that. It's a very, very different formation, which curiously, which is sort of unusual, right, for at least dominant strains, I think, of much of the American right, seems precisely to be like learning from Europe, in this case, Eastern Central Europe, and to be networked with these, the conferences are organized with, the Matthäus Corvinus Institute and the Christian Zionist massive foundations from the States. This is actually like also a materially integrated process, which again is interesting. So I think that's worth thinking through, because then I think Nikhil is really right. Like, what does it mean to not, to not accept that, both as Robin said, to take very seriously what's happening at the level of these institutions, but also not to accept that these are the only fighting grounds, or rather maybe to think that if you only fight on those grounds, you will lose those grounds as well, right? Because also you won't be able to build in the very domains that Nikhil was saying rightly, show a very different popular experience of collectivity and diversity, etc. You will be simply being the very left that they imagine you to be.
Autumn, are you admitting that the Nazis were leftist?
Mimetic.
Are you admitting the Nazis were socialist?
Game. And
thank
so
you,
I think
Autumn, for that
is also very
admonition.
important.
We really appreciate that.
What
I think it's good. It's a positive step
and
forward, Autumn, for
mean is also
you,
to
a socialist,
exactly
who admit that the Nazis
the state is.
were
And of course,
also
in the US,
socialist.
it's a very different, it's like a very different mode, right, than it might be in Canada, where I live, or indeed in many European countries, because of the role of state legislatures and the role of sovereign sheriffs movements at the local domain, which is one of the more troubling forms of fascisation I can think of. So I think that I think is a very important dimension of our discussion, and which shifts what we understand, perhaps both by the U.S. potentials and tendencies to fascism, and about fascisation more broadly.
One of the most mesmerizing conflicts at the moment is between Disney and DeSantis, and
I'm gonna blow their minds in the chat. I'm gonna blow their fucking minds.
Feeling of a plague on both your houses.
DeSantis,
I wish I could draw up a synthetic derivative so I can bet on Disney and get rich. Because I basically follow Paxton's notion that no far-right fascism ever comes into power unless it's made its peace with capital, the oligarchy, and the church, or in America, the Church of Disney. Do you buy something along the lines of what Nikhil says about seeing all these things and dealing with them, that the kind of 5 stages model where many of the elements that are most disturbing about the far right,
they think DeSantis is going to win,
have to literally go? For example, possibly even the immigration thing, because capital needs all that labor to come in, the cheap labor from
going to
the rest
win
of the world.
The nomination, right?
When you get to stage 4 or 5, when the far right really is the power taking over the government. In other words, you see,
I have read May now
in some way able to use them for small skirmishes,
is my puppet.
but acting as some kind of guard from preventing, let's say, some sort of insane Nazi government? Or does capital miscalculate here? Or am I even framing the process in the wrong way?
I mean, one thing maybe we could say that, partly it's because of these both structural and maybe direct forms of compulsion that come indeed from the sources of funding and the political economy, right, of the intellectual and organizational life of the far right, that you also have the hypertrophy, the excess, the libidinal surplus, right, to go back to Robin's arguments, of its culture warring, right? Because of course there is also, in some sense, there is also a dirty conscience that there is no alternative for them either, right? These are not, and that in some sense, the transformative character and what is being sold for electoral and indeed subjective libidinal purposes is something that has to be made compatible, and in fact is even driven by a reproduction of a status quo, right? You see this also in the case of Italy, where you have, as a prime minister, somebody who was actually in a fascist youth movement that thought of itself as fascist and advertised its fascism, who nevertheless, unsurprisingly, given Italy's place within the political
What's going on?
economy of the European
Philip has a
Union,
dog.
is extremely,
Philip has a dog.
mild and polite vis-a-vis troubling any of the either economic or indeed foreign policy,
Philip, you better
functions
treat that dog
of
good
Italy
and not
within
make
the
him a
Atlantic
communist.
Alliance, taking an even stronger position on supporting Ukraine, or the sort of NATO version of supporting Ukraine than anyone else, etc. Right? And so I also think that this is an important kind of dynamic, right? That you intensify the biopolitical, the exclusive, the dog whistling, or just the straight out kind of racial persecution, partly, because you're not willing or wanting to change anything about the structures of social, a structure of socioeconomic life more broadly, right? And some people, of course, would say that about the original fascism as well, right? That the intensity of the superstructural cultural revolution dimension, partly because actually the structures of property and of ownership and of class and of income, etc., are actually remarkably often untouched, right, by these movements. So in that sense, there is a kind of continuity, but at least that's my take on it.
He moderated the chat. He removed it.
Nikhil or Robin, anything to add on this?
And one of the things I think Alberto says in the
I
beginning
asked him
of
if we
his
could see
book,
his
if I'm
dog, and he
remembering
removed it from
correctly,
the
is
chat.
that there are aspects of the contemporary far right that kind of are. I mean, the contemporary far right is actually kind of dystopian in its outlook, rather than
What?
sort of mobilizing utopian elements. It's not to say that there
You
isn't
guys think you're
a discourse
utopian
about
and the
freedom
far
or
right
the
is
equality of equals or anything like that, but
okay,
there's almost
focus.
a kind of sense that the right faces the insuperable force and needs to somehow figure out a way to kind of secede, or to fracture everything, to kind of leave it in
Ironclad
ruin,
law of woke
right?
projection. He's saying the
And
right
maybe
is
that's
trying to
how it will come
destabilize everything,
about.
when in fact they are trying to
There isn't a
destabilize
positive
everything.
program on the right? And I think that's, at least on the American right, and I think that's one of the kind of startling things when you see the one thing they want from the debt ceiling debate is less funding to go after tax cheats, right? They literally want the ability to continue to figure out how to hoard, how to allow the wealthiest private individuals to continue to hoard wealth, right? And I do think that we are experiencing decline, in a sense.
It's the people's dog, Philip.
There's an attrition and a decay of the infrastructure, of the public goods that are kind of the patrimony of the sort of the New Deal era in a certain way, and they really do become maintained and preserved only where they serve the very wealthy. And I think we've seen what that means.
You really
and
think
so,
that Trump supporters
in
are the
that
very
sense,
wealthy?
The right
Hang
and
on.
the collusion of progressives with the right in this kind of way, is really just a symptom of our impasse, right? And the impasse kind of covers over the volatility that we know is just beneath the surface, right? And the volatility will erupt, and it has continually erupted in the last 10, 20 years, right? And the George Floyd rebellion was just the latest example. And I think there's an awareness
I still can't believe they're calling
that
it
volatility exists, that there is a kind of
There's going to be a movie
there is a
someday with
kind
that
of
title. You
social
guys know that,
force
right?
that is ungovernable
The George Floyd
and
Rebellion.
threatening to both the right and the center. But they can't really agree on how to manage that. And neither of them really know how to master that volatility, and neither really have an answer. The progressives have more of an answer in something like whatever the Inflation Reduction Act, and the idea that we're going to make good on the promise of
The Inflation Reduction Act didn't reduce inflation.
Some kind of idea of an economy, a political economy of growth. But do any of us really believe that political economic program is going to be successful? At least it's a political economic program. But the right doesn't really have one. At least that's a political economic program that has some plausibility, right? But I don't really see much of a way through this impasse, other than the trajectory towards more war at the geopolitical scale.
Thank you, Shauna.
And honestly, that's what really, really worries me. And I don't know
agree with you,
how to
but
think of that exactly in relationship
well, I
to
agree though
fascism
there are elements
in
of the
United
far right that are
States,
doing this, but in
because
general I think he's
that
projecting.
is probably the moment that you get the sort of return
That
of
element
some
does
kind
exist,
of
so you're right
compact
about that.
between the center and the right in kind of the sort of the project of American militarism, which is what you're seeing in Ukraine, in fact, right now.
But it's interesting because it's sort of ideologically disavowed, right? So if we think of traditional forms of fascism as the explicit celebration, desire, promotion, and organization, right, of militarized expansionism, imperialism, etc., there is something very striking from the outside, so to speak, about the fact that you have these processes of fascization on the right, where this is just not, aside from a kind of rote, go USA, whatever, like there isn't actually any. In fact, if anything, there are these weird protectionist, isolationist kind of tendencies. And on the other hand, this massive, almost unprecedented and starkly dangerous form of promotion of or intensification of war in the case of the Ukraine is only presented as a sort of like,
you don't say Ukraine with
a liberal, like Cold War liberal nostalgia and celebration of something that is presented as just the good and in some sense implicitly anti-fascist US, right? Because this is kind of what it really is. I mean, if you see it through the writings of Timothy Snyder, then you would think that Joe Biden is like what anti-fascism
but you don't say
is today,
the with Ukraine, just say Ukraine.
Fascism, and
I'm married to a
Ukrainian
Ukrainian.
Struggle for liberation from those forces, right? But it's not like, it's kind of removed, and then the question of China is treated very like in some kind of often very separate way. So I think that's a really, speaking of the disanalogies, discrepancies, dislocations, etc., that we've talked about the question of the state, but the question of war, which of course was the sinews of fascism too, is very oddly present and not present, whilst this delegated, super militarized, murderous virility is like everywhere, like at least in the States,
the
right?
Last day of Red May. I'm going to do what I want.
Not in some
Philip
continuum
wouldn't dare block me
with the idea of the projection of power abroad, right? Which is this kind of, technical, logistical,
Philip and I are basically best friends
that's
now.
not subjectivizable, right? Like it's not like the war in Ukraine is something that is felt as like related to the subjectivity of the gun owner, or of the, like, it's a totally different space, right? Which is very different, I think, than previous iterations of actually existing American militarism, right? And the right is not really interested in that. And that's, I think, somewhat novel, right? Vis-a-vis even 20 years ago.
Definitely.
Take questions, Philip.
Listening to your various accounts, I'm struck by the prevalence of nostalgia among various fractions of American politics. We can even say that if Reconstruction is the point where American history sort of stopped, and we're still we would have to finish it to have our revolution. The other side has been characterized as the lost cause of what racism believed for a lot, white supremacy and so forth. We have the nostalgia for the New Deal or for the Cold War among liberals. What sort of nostalgia are we prey to on the left that we could fall into as this extremely volatile situation of which there's no, there doesn't seem to be an agent that can master it in some way that we can unite behind? Maybe that's a bit of nostalgia that I'm impressing there for the proletariat or something. But what would you say left nostalgia takes? Or am I going to Wendy Brown here and going back?
I mean, I'm happy to sort of think with Wendy Brown. For me, what resonates most in her work is really thinking about wounded attachments, the forms of wounded attachment that kind of persist on the left, some of which I think Nikhil was describing among his students. And I sort of, listening to some of my students, I feel like, rereading States of Injury becomes quite an important task for a moment. And it makes me kind of appreciate the politics of that intervention. I sort of appreciate the kind of radicalism of the project of that book in a different way in the contemporary moment. And I also think about her work on waning sovereignty and sort of treating, she I think was really quite alert to the politics of walling, for instance, the mobilization of a kind of American militia around the fantasy of an enclosed and walled America, but also really trying to think of that in, again, a kind of global geopolitical context, right? And so she had her kind of eye on Israel-Palestine and thinking about how it modeled a form of waning sovereignty that then gets kind of developed and differently iterated on the US-Mexico border. And so for me, at least in the sort of, and then finally, and this brings me back to Alberto's point about militarism, I think about, we're really going to go at a kind of Wendy Brown deep cut. I'm sort of thinking about politics and manhood, and sort of thinking about how it's almost kind of trite and trivial to invoke this idea of a kind of crisis in masculinity or a crisis in manhood. And yet I think some of her early work, thinking with and against Machiavelli, Weber, and others, she's really trying to think about how a certain construction of politics itself is based in a kind of anxious and therefore violent masculinity. And so there are, I think, aspects of that analysis that sort of once she finds Foucault, she might think about differently.
I don't know about that,
but it's kind of that
Thank
trajectory in her thinking that has been most useful for me. I might also want to pick up on Nikhil's, I think, very important point about, what we might say is like fascism as symptom. And especially symptom of the kind of collapse or kind of hollowing out of public institutions, and public provision. And I'll get sort of, again, a little bit kind of concrete once again, and sort of think about the application of an anti-trans politics on the right, and maybe the differences between Britain and the US are illuminating in this context. Because for those of us who have kind of followed these debates and these kind of eruptions, one of the things that has often said is that there's a particularly virulent strain of transphobia that flourishes on the other side of the pond, right, in the UK, and that the US has been largely sort of immune from it, or at least has charted a different course. You know, when I look, I see actually something quite different. I see that in Britain, there is a form of transphobia that has really managed to seize upon a set of political and economic anxieties. And so I notice especially that it seems to me that both the crisis of the NHS are sort of what are the sort of set of conjunctural conditions to which the contemporary British right has responded, the sort of sense of looming crisis for the NHS. And then, of course, also in the context of Brexit, this idea of the kind of the trans agenda being somehow at one with this kind of invasion of the British nation. Then when I look at the American context, right, and I see that as a set of public anxieties. It's like anxieties and symptoms over a kind of collapsing or sense of collapsing public infrastructure. And I look over here and it strikes me that on this side of the ocean, there is a form of anti-trans politics that has really been able to get activated around, I would identify two pillars. First, Title IX, and second, prisons. And you might say depressingly, right? That's because these are our only public institutions over here, right? Like we don't have an NHS, right? And so it's not around that set of collapsing public provision that a kind of an anti-trans right-wing politics can really find its momentum.
That literally
here
makes no sense.
We have, I think, something quite different, which is like, you know, Title IX, a set of anxieties around what trans existence and experience might mean for the achievements of Title IX. And for our vast prison infrastructure, right, which has been organized
is this related
through
to
not
prisons?
only sex segregation, but sexual violence, right, and the sort of deliberate administration of sexual violence. And so it seems to me that it is all by way of agreeing absolutely with Nikhil's point that we also have to sort of know how to read for the symptom, right? Alberto's work, which I think has also drawn from a kind of Marxist psychoanalytic tradition, is very skilled at this capacity to kind of read for the symptom. And so not to kind of inflate or exaggerate our enemy, but also to understand
I just asked
the kind of real
that
conditions that those formations actually reflect and invite us to think through.
Like, she's really stretching with this prison argument.
That was such a great and helpful.
And I'm sympathetic to the prison abolition stuff. I really am, but she's stretching.
Robin, I just to go back to this question of nostalgia, and
Autumn, you
don't
got banned
know
from
if
Red
this is
May.
nostalgia. I fear what I'm going to say because
I outlasted you on Red May.
I worry that it's nostalgia and that we sound silly. But I just feel like how do we create the terms of solidarity? Like, how do we think about solidarity in the context of manipulated seriality?
Solidarity is a word that only socialists use.
Confined to fascism, obviously. It's the condition.
I am the queen of the Red May chat.
In many ways. You know, I live in New York City, and one of the things I always love about New York City is that you're lost and you're looking for something, a New Yorker will like jump in and chime in with the directions, you know, and there's something about like the kind of habitus, right, of life in the city.
Except Philip didn't like me asking about his
encourages
dog.
certain kinds of just very ordinary sorts of solidarity and helpfulness that I love about living in the city. But I would also say, and that I have just noticed, and this is really since COVID and after,
Philip
that
deleted
the
my question
bonds
about
have
the prisons.
frayed a lot in the last
Robin
few
brought it up,
years.
Philip.
And there's a way in which it goes beyond indifference to certain kinds of contempt. It's very tied to the greater presence of the houseless and the mentally ill on the street, and the kind of the rise, although not the extreme rise, but the rise of like kind of random violence that people experience, and then the sort of the sort of deterioration of public services, that I think lead people to sort of have a sense of kind of the environment as not as friendly, right? And I'm just going based upon this is like my own, like in some ways completely bourgeois sensibilities, right?
Thank you
as a
for
middle
admitting you're
class urban
bourgeois,
dweller,
Nikhail. Thank you for admitting that.
Thinks though about what are the terms under which we would be
Nikhail
able
is
to
the enemy.
recapture or recover some kind of sense of a wider, more capable, organized political life on the left, you know. To me, that seems to be the only way I could imagine us being able to move forward. That's the only kind of anti-fascist politics that seems viable, right? It's fully non-exclusionary, but that's actually also about figuring out how to rebuild the sort of forms of mediating connection, that I think used to at least somewhat militate against the manipulated seriality of liquid modernity, if you will, right?
Is that a real word?
Whether it's like the trade union or the civic association or the sports team or the or the church, even the temple, whatever it is, and I see places where some people have that, but I also and I think it really matters, but I also see how fewer and fewer people have that. At least that's my sense. But then I'm like, is that just nostalgia or my own kind of imagination of
it
something
is your
that
own
has
lack
been
of understanding about
lost,
so many things,
that
Nikhail.
needs to come back. I do think it relates to the question of technology that Robin raised. I have two daughters, so I watch them and try to think about how they're socializing with each other. One of the best things they have are their sports teams, and their clubs, and they're kind of just places to be collectively active and creative together and to feel like they're doing something. And I just feel like so many people lack that. They lack access to that, any kind of form, any kind of collective
How would
form.
Nikhail like it if a man joined his daughter's sports
But then,
team?
is that nostalgia? I mean, I'm asking you seriously for help.
The other close to a question I was going to ask about the libidinal and enjoyment, where essentially, for whatever reason, there does seem to be a kind of fascist enjoyment that people who participate in this movement get. And if you look at liberalism, it sort of offers nothing. It can be personified as a pompous bore, I think. And what are the forms of left enjoyment that would go along with solidarity? Is that nostalgia for? I'm not looking back towards the SPD and saying we got to have all these sort of organizations that really mimic the ones in society, but beyond the sophomore teen or something, there must be some ways to recreate, to create new bonds and new forms of enjoyment.
Philip, can you ask any of my questions, please? I think that'd be pretty great. This is the last
Let
episode.
me see quickly if no one has to say anything about that. Some of the questions from the web.
Thank you, Philip.
They're not being sent in where I can see them, and usually we just sort of sift through them and find which ones are serious questions. I don't know, Robert or Ranjang, is there anything?
They're
you can
all
throw
serious
in,
questions.
The chat section here, so I can see if there are some questions. while we're waiting for that, Alberto, do you have anything to say? We haven't heard from you in a while. We've covered quite a lot of ground.
I mean, maybe something that ties together the libidinal question and the question of masculinity that Robin was raising, and then the issue of collective forms of solidarity, is that, you know, one of the things that's very difficult to parse, and one of the dimensions of the lateness that I was trying to underscore is, you know, what
I'm
happens
going into overdrive here. This is
when
the
we're
last
thinking of
chance.
fascism, but, you know, also of anti-fascism, in contexts that are not hegemonized, whether at the imaginary or the real level, by various forms of, you know, gendered industrial
no one
labor,
would date
right?
Robin, Autumn.
And
Robin
one
is
of the things that's
obviously
very
frigid.
curious,
It is
of
a
course,
horrible
about
idea.
the
What are you talking
contemporary
about?
gender panics,
Truly.
and the foregrounding of certain
just poor
forms of
taste.
virility, etc., on the far right, is that, I mean, they're deeply nostalgic, but they also know themselves not to desire anything that involves, you know, the relationship between a man and his machine before he comes home to his family, right? And so there's something very peculiar, I find. If you know, on the one hand, you have these massive continuities, the fact that, and this is something I think I cite in the book, right, that the fact that panic, you know, great replacement panics, right, are the bread and butter of 1920s fascism. You know, Mussolini prefaces a book on the decrease in births together with Oswald Spengler. The author turns out to be the person who did the statistical work for the SS on the final solution, right? Like, that's the world in which this idea of the great replacement develops as a response to what all of these figures, including Spengler,
and she's
but then
frigid,
in the US context,
and you will never have sex again. It's a horrible idea, Autumn.
The colored world revolution, right?
But
Which is both
if you want to go try, go give it a shot.
Revolution, and that's where this.
We'll see how that goes,
right? And of course, that is still very much present in the centrality of panics over migration, which are now, of course, interlinked with ones about the very, well, the present and predictable future effects of massive anthropogenic climate change on people's movements and so on and so forth. But again, it's in the absence, right? Like, so on the one hand, you have, you know, sort of Trump surrounding himself with coal miners from coal mines that are, you know, completely vestigial dimensions of the economy. You have this stress of masculinity, but it's not, you know, Fordist in kind, right? And so, but I think the problem is, and I think to me, like, the sort of problem of the far left, and I think, you know, Nikhil put it very well in his own comment, is
this bullshit
again.
Know,
the problem is very asymmetrical again, right? Like, it's the left cannot play and cannot enjoy itself at the superstructural level in the same way, right?
I learn new things about myself every day on the internet.
Solidarities
I didn't even have a honeymoon.
Inequalities are curtailed, and emancipation
so
takes
that's
place,
not
right?
true.
Much as the technologies with which we exist and the political arenas in which we, alas, operate draw us to that, right? Like, draw us to the endless kind of pantomime and performance of conflict, right? So I think that's a real issue. This is not to discount the fact that, of course, you know, and this is something that many people have noted, is that, you know, the far right also works through real forms through real collective forms, right?
Literally
through, you know,
Hitler,
bands of brothers, and all sorts of organizations, from, you know, biker gangs to CrossFit or whatever, right? Like, so all of these things are very present, right? Like, and actually people do exist.
Philip, moderate the chat.
Lots of social, you know, different social forms, many of them manipulated and serial and atomized, etc. But I think the bulk, you know, the sort of the visible bulk of these far right fascization processes are much more rhetorical, right? They don't
I've given them very good information about the
pervade
right and how wrong they are
civil
today, but they won't
society, let's say,
listen
in the
per
way that someone like
usual.
Dylan Riley studies for 1920s Italy, Romania, and Spain, etc. Right? Those things are present, but I think the bulk of
If
it
these
is
people would
taking
just
place
listen, they would learn so much
driven
more.
by, it has a very spectacular
well.
and electorally oriented dimension, right, which kind of dominates this. And so I do think that any anti-fascist politics worth its salt will involve also really organizing things that one would want to defend from fascism, right? Like that's rather than just blocking their machinations. And so I think it will come out of, once again, alas, right? Like out of people collectively organizing to, provide safe abortions, or in states where it's illegal.
That means the abortion
or,
pill, self-managed bathroom abortion. That is the
defend,
plan.
Parents who are being persecuted because their child transitioned or whatever, right? Like all sorts of different phenomena. But I think
you want parents
yeah,
to be
it can't simply be seen in the sense of castigating, pointing to.
That's a white identitarian.
Resisting.
That's a legitimate white identitarian.
The process of kind of fascization or the growth of the far right at this just kind of legislative, institutional, and rhetorical way. So in that sense, I really agree with Nikhil's orientation on this. So.
That's the fascist
Well,
right.
how about
Philip?
Oh, are we frozen here? Okay, we can do that. The other thing I thought about left enjoyment was music. Not the Spanish Civil War, we lost the war, but we had better songs. But thinking of the function of the Nueva Canción in Chile, which almost embodied all the social change and existed in a kind of solidaristic way where one could come into a gathering with a guitar and sit around and become part of it and kind of imbibe.
Jason Cohn is a white nationalist.
That sense of utopian hope.
Wow.
That music embodies.
This is next level lunacy.
Which is why that the guy who cut off Victor Jara's hands.
I would never lower myself to date a piece of shit like Jason
going
Kona.
Directly at what was released.
Please, that little fucker.
So forth. So maybe we should all hope for a work for a new wave of left music that will sweep us all up and orient us towards the coming struggles. Unfortunately, the
I don't know that that's going to work out. Emphasize, but
working here
we'll
today,
see.
so I can't pull in neither our trolls questions or the occasional good question that gets put in between.
Philip.
So I'm afraid, since I can't see anything, I can't ask it.
What are you talking about?
Maybe
you can't
this is a
You've
good
been
moment
moderating
to
it the whole time.
Stop this fascinating discussion, which I could continue for a couple hours.
Autumn is not banned in their chat. Autumn is a liar.
Live, but
Autumn, you said you were banned.
I can listen to all of you endlessly. I really and read. Please do.
No, I tried to help Philip. That's a legitimate fascist in their chat. The nationalist guy, legitimate fascist.
Nikhil, how are you doing on the?
Help.
I know you're working on a third book now, or I don't want to do the writer's block thing or so forth. But are we? Will we see it soon?
Oh
or,
goodness!
Oops, can't hear you.
You've been moderating the chat.
Hopefully within a year or so.
Okay, and could you tell us what it's about? It's also about foreign policy, and
it's called Reconstructing Democracy.
We could have worked together.
It's sort of a defense of the category of democracy, which I still would want to defend, and I still hold on to the idea that fascism is ultimately antithetical to democracy, even though it also is I think a deviation of democratic politics in certain ways. So but it comes out of my work on Black intellectuals, so it'll be another iteration of that.
That should be great. One of the best ways I find to defend democracy is to claim that all we've ever had is liberalism, and which is choking democracy. i.e. the Supreme Court and all those checks and balances. Robin, what are you working on now?
Why don't we just get rid of the Supreme Court, right?
I am also finishing a book. I am also finishing a book that I hope and expect to be finished in the next year or so. And it's on critical theory, critical theory in the family.
We'll look forward to that, Robin.
That the tradition of critical theory kind of discovers and develops its distinctive concept of the political in and through.
She's going to use critical theory to argue for the abolition of the family. Is what she's going to
do. Tell a kind of different, alternate, and maybe more expansive story of the tradition of critical theory, and also
these people,
develop.
Like once you decode them, they're so simple. Everything leads to abolition of the family. Everything.
Conversation with the feminist tradition, and so it's also really about drawing out and amplifying a kind of feminist potential, kind of harbored in this unlikely tradition dominated by men, and mostly European men, and also using the feminist tradition to kind of challenge some of the lingering patriarchal and androcentric kind of conceits that permeate that tradition.
I wanted to really just thank, before we go, Robin and Nikhil for such extremely generous engagements. It's been like a real pleasure.
Are the white nationalists getting
talk with you, and
about
hopefully,
me again?
yes,
really?
the proverbial drink or meeting in person will happen sooner rather than later. And thanks
Philip,
again to
you just
Philip
moderated
and
the
Red
chat
May
again.
for,
You can absolutely see the chat, Philip. You are such a liar.
Hey, thank you all, and thank you out there for watching. We have one more event tomorrow.
Why do you like white nationalists,
the legal crisis
Philip?
in Chile, which will probably bring up the notion of fascism in it. It has Gerardo
No, I think
Munoz,
he's just moderating it.
Rodrigo
I don't think he's
Carmi,
banning
and
people. He's moderating.
Alejandra Castillo. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys. Well, that is our last episode of Red May. We made it. We watched more socialism this month than the socialists, but that I'm gonna be honest. Like when I say Jason Kana is like a white identitarian, like I actually mean that. He really is. He's one of the most toxic people on the internet, and so I'm a little perturbed that one of Jason Kana's followers is stalking me in a chat on a socialist channel. And I'm wondering what that means, because I thought I got rid of those assholes 2 years ago. And, yeah, that's a whole new fresh hell. I'm not sure what to think about that. But I don't have much time to think about that now because I have to go get ready for my normal 5 p.m. stream. But guys, congratulations. If you made it through Red May, that was a feat. That was a feat in and of itself. What the hell do I have in my eye? That was a feat in and of itself. We watched more socialism than I'm sure many of you have watched in your life. We made it through the entire month. If you missed any of the socialism streams, they are all, of course, are archived on the channel. And of course, we will continue to do our regular Socialism Saturday, popping in for a socialism stream every once in a while in between if we get the if we have the opportunity to do it, or if it's live. It is always fun to kind of crash their chat and see what we can get away with. I was really disappointed in Philip, who was moderating the chat the entire time. Didn't ask a single one of my questions. Couldn't even answer where they get their sources on the political right. What can you do? What can you do? But we made it, guys. I'm going to go take a little break. I'm going to figure out what I'm streaming about at 5 p.m. and we will be back for the regular 5 p.m. stream then. See you guys soon. Take care. Mount the like button on the way out the door. We'll see you.